The Nile, it's synonymous with Egypt and supplies almost 100% of its water. It's the longest river in the world, rising up out of the Eastern Africa region with sources from the Ethiopian highlands. But with the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance dam project almost finished, is Egypt heading for a water crisis? Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Shuli Ghosh. Ethiopia's $5 billion Grand Dam will be the largest in Africa, generating around 6,000 megawatts of electricity for both domestic use and export. But could it spark a power shift between Egypt and Ethiopia? As the world heats up and water becomes scarce, what are countries prepared to do to protect this precious resource? It's Egypt's only fertile ground, supplying 97% of the water entering the country. While the Nile Basin extends to 11 African countries, Egypt's claim to the river is enshrined in the Anglo-Egyptian Treaty and a bilateral agreement between Cairo and Sudan. But Ethiopia is building a dam near the border with Sudan, putting management of the flow of the Blue Nile in its hands. Will it spark a power shift when it's complete? Well, let me introduce today's panel. Joining us on Skype from Utah in the US is John Mukum Mbaku, co-author of Governing the Nile Basin, the search for a new legal regime. Also on Skype from Doha in Qatar is Harry Verhoeven, professor of government at Georgetown University. Here with me at the round table we have Adel Darwish, veteran journalist and author of Water Wars, Coming Conflicts in the Middle East, and Abdurahman, Sayed-Bohashem, an East Africa analyst. Gentlemen, good to have all of you on the programme. Abdurahman, let me start with you because, as we know, control of the Nile and its waters has long since been a source of friction. Is Ethiopia now challenging Egypt directly for control of that?
Absolutely. The challenge is coming from both the legal and economic needs of Ethiopia and the upstream countries. In your report, you referred to the 1929 agreement, which Ethiopia was not party to. That agreement was done between the United Kingdom and Egypt. The United Kingdom was representing its own colonies, of which Ethiopia was not one.
Egypt got a very favourable deal.
Absolutely. So the 1929 deal gives Egypt veto power, which means no one can do anything along the River Nile without Egypt's agreement. Now, Ethiopia was not party to this. Ethiopia was not part of the colonies of United Kingdom. And the other issue is the Ethiopian population has grown enormously. Currently, the number of Ethiopians is around 100 million plus.
And Ethiopia is trying to secure its future and become a middle-income country.
Absolutely. There's that project, plus 60% of Ethiopians currently do not have access to electricity. And the agriculture in Ethiopia is still used in labor-intensive ways, which does not really produce enough, which is why then Ethiopia suffers from famine and other sorts of food shortages. So there are acute needs for Ethiopians to address.
And this is why it's building the Renaissance Dam. But Adel, you're quite critical of Ethiopia's role in this, and in fact you're quite critical of dams altogether.
Yes, just to add to what Abdurahman says, actually 1929 was not an agreement, it was a treaty.
It was a treaty.
International law is much stronger, as you know, than an agreement. Okay.
But haven't circumstances changed since
I know that circumstances changed because you see what happened with treaties, you always have an appendixes and attachments to it. And if the part of what the whole at that time, if we talk about Colonel Nasser 1959 agreement with Sudan and so on, then there were 9 riparian nations. Now there are actually 11 riparian nations. Dams actually are old-fashioned. They were in the United States and the Soviet Union in the 1920s and 30s. What we know now, we didn't know then. The effect on the environment is the erosion when the water actually runs faster without silt there, and the Egyptians, even their high dam I was critical of when they start building in 1959. But having said so, also in international law, you have something called the customary right of use. So you can't deprive someone from a customary right by use, which was established in 1949 between India and Pakistan.
Do you think this dam is going to reduce the supply of water in Egypt, which is what Egypt is worried about?
Yes, it's worried about. Obviously, the whole 11 riparian state, they should actually split into two groups. The Blue Nile group sought out some kind of economic agreement, and the White Nile group, which again we'll probably talk later in the program. There is another project that would provide Egypt with actually a lost 20 million cubic kilometer that gets through evaporation. Egypt should have been actually supplying Ethiopia with electricity, because if your country is producing water, it's like you putting money in a bank. You should get a return on it.
I'd like to ask John, because we're talking about the fact that Egypt says it has a legal and historical claim over the Nile waters, but do the other countries of the Nile River Basin accept this?
Of course not. As our other guest has already mentioned, the Ethiopians argue that they were not part of the Anglo-Egyptian Treaty of 1929. And they were not also part of the bilateral agreement between Egypt and Sudan. The other riparian countries that were supposedly being represented by Great Britain have argued, and this was an argument that was made at independence by the president of Tanzania, that their interests were not represented by Britain, because when the agreement was signed in 1929, Britain was primarily interested in its agricultural interests in Egypt, and that even though this is an international treaty, it cannot be held against them because they were not party to it. And in fact, at independence, Tanzania tried to renounce the treaty and argue that since they were not present and were not part of the negotiations, they should not be held to it. But besides that point, one thing that we need to consider very carefully is the fact that the populations of these countries have increased. Their ability to utilize waters of the Nile River have also significantly changed. And I think that from the point of view of equity and fairness, Egypt has to understand that those people, the other riparian countries, need to be considered when it comes to the allocations of the waters of the Nile.
And Harry, I'm sure that is exactly what Ethiopia will be arguing. And in fact, it's timed this project very cleverly, because at the time Egypt was going through a massive upheaval when Ethiopia was unveiling this massive hydroelectric project, which it says is going to move it, massively improve its economic development.
Well, that's right. Of course, Ethiopia had been for many years preparing this big push, but the exact timing of the push in April 2011, of course, was not coincidental. It was exactly 2 months after the Egyptian revolution ousted President Hosni Mubarak. And so for Ethiopia, this was in many ways a very symbolic moment. It was also 3 months before the independence of South Sudan, 9th of July 2011. And so Ethiopia thought, as there is this wider pattern of regional changes happening, let us add a final but very important capstone to this, namely changes in the way we deal with water in the Nile Basin. And so in Ethiopia, for Ethiopia, it's been a long way coming since 1991, when the country was on its knees, when it was falling apart, when it came out of civil war, which claimed the lives of 1 million people. Since then, it's really transformed itself. It's the only country in Africa that's probably industrializing significantly, where significant amounts of jobs are being created, not just in agriculture or in the service sector, but also in export-led industries. And so in that sense, they see indeed this project as absolutely vital to the continued transformation of the country, as well as to the political legitimacy of its rulers. And this is also, of course, why Ethiopia has been so reluctant to make any major concessions vis-a-vis Egypt or vis-a-vis other states, because it feels that what it's doing is its right and it's in its interest.
But the governments are talking about this, right? There have been negotiations between Ethiopia and Egypt and Sudan. How are those talks going?
Those negotiations have been focused on the dam that the Ethiopians are building, so they're not really addressing the core issue.
The whole thing as a
Right.
whole, yes.
The core
exactly.
issue of the disagreement, which is, as I said earlier, the Ethiopians are saying, look, we were not part to this treaty that our friend referred to.
Technically, is Ethiopia actually breaking the terms of the treaty by
No,
building
absolutely. No, because legally
not,
it
right.
was not party to that, and nor was it a colony from the British colonies, who can claim that they would have been represented by the British at the time. But the second issue is what the Ethiopians are saying. Look, this is outdated agreement, whether it's the treaty, the 1929, or even the Anglo-Sudanese agreement in 1959. What they're saying now, let's come all together, all 11 countries, and have a new treaty where we all have to share this resource. So they're not really denying
Egypt is not interested.
The Egyptians are having a slight problem with this because they want to maintain the veto power and all the privileges the 1929 treaty gives them.
You see, we legally, let's go on to the legal question now. Why the Anglo-Egyptians had this power? Because they were the only power providing protection militarily, were the only power who providing engineering, the only power who actually paying economically for the maintenance of the whole Nile from Victoria and Albert Lake all the way to the Mediterranean. As you said, circumstances change. You cannot have someone who's outside a treaty and say, oh, I'm coming to muscle again, do it. That's an argument. There's not a stand in a court of law.
Treaties are meant to evolve. Treaties are meant to change.
Absolutely.
To take
That's
account
what I
of
meant.
the reality on the ground.
Absolutely.
But also,
they should have had any appendixes. And the Nile Basin should actually, it's not 11. There are 2 Niles. So you have Ethiopia, Eritrea, Sudan, South Sudan, and Egypt in one group. And then you have the others who are Uganda, Tanzania, Kenya, Sudan, Egypt.
So all
in one,
total
I can see that
group.
Harry wants to add to this. Harry, what's your point?
Yeah, well, here's the thing. I mean, in 2010, there was a new treaty indeed drawn up, the Cooperation Framework Agreement, and Egypt has actually, for the most part, accepted that agreement, but there's one major point on which Egypt and Ethiopia and other upper riparian states remain divided, and that is the question of whether or not, A, one recognizes historical user rights, and B, whether or not any international agreement, be it a treaty or any other legal arrangement, should actually recognize explicitly volumetric allocations, because what is at the moment, of course, at stake in 1929, 1959, is that a very specific share of waters is reserved for Egypt and for Sudan. What Ethiopia and the other upper riparians are arguing is that one should remove those exact volumetric targets of respectively 55.5 billion cubic meters of water and 18.5 billion cubic meters of water, and saying that instead we should try to think about this water from a basin perspective as a whole rather than from the perspective of individual states. And so it's fundamentally a different approach to what it means to deal with water security in the 21st century. And that's rather an important discussion, and that's essentially where the difference lies, at least in terms of rhetoric, between the two sides.
And what is, John, maybe you can answer this question, what is Sudan's position on this? Because as we've said, Sudan has a bilateral agreement with Cairo, which guarantees it, I can't remember the figure off the top of my head, but several, a certain volume, yes, of Nile water. So where does Sudan stand on the position of Ethiopia's dam?
Well, the Sudanese, as far as I can understand, tend to side with the Egyptians, primarily because they benefit from both the Anglo-Egyptian treaty, the Anglo-Egyptian treaty and the bilateral agreement between Egypt and Sudan. Sudan was given 18.5 billion cubic meters, and the Egyptians 55.5 billion cubic meters. I think this discussion here is missing one important point, and that is the fact that we cannot look at the Nile River as representing the White Nile and the Blue Nile. We have to look at the river as an entire international water course. and understand the fact that the Ethiopian highlands provide more than 80% of the water that goes into the Nile, and look at the management of the Nile as a regional issue as opposed to something to be looked at from the point of view of individual nations.
Right.
If we are looking at it from the point of view of individual nations, we're going to have problems. We have to look at the water as something that belongs to all the 11 riparian states, and then sit down together and try to have an agreement that would provide for equity and reasonableness in allocation.
And there is no doubt that water resources are becoming increasingly scarce. And for Egypt says it's a matter of life and death.
It's becoming increasingly scarce because of the actually abuse and misuse of it. You know, you've got sort of the Saudis growing wheat in the desert, which is madness, because the Canadians throwing it in the sea.
Is it becoming scarce because of climate changes or increasing population?
Well, it's mainly misuse,
factors,
and the agriculture is the most abusive part. Let's talk about solutions, really, not about the problem.
Right.
We've talked about history. I have been screaming from rooftops since the 1980s of actually treating basins as a hydraulic bank. So call it the hydraulic investment.
So like a water bank.
Like a water bank.
Where water is the gold.
We say, okay, each million cubic meter is $1 for example. So you have the southern countries like Uganda and Tanzania and Sudan are the people who putting this hydraulic dollars, and they should get a return on it. If the Egyptians and the Sudanese are actually growing wheat, growing rice, the amount of actually water used to grow a ton of rice is actually a consumption that you should pay interest on.
Where does that leave projects like the hydroelectric?
It will leave projects like this that should have been built in the first place, but already built. So Egypt and Ethiopia should, for example, use the electronic to power other sort of station and sell power to the desert for desalination. The Jonglei Canal, we have the Sud area in Sudan. John will probably know more about it than me. You have the evaporation every year is 20 cubic kilometers. And that actually would supply nearly 2/3 of the water that the Ethiopians would take.
So what do the rest of you think about it? Water should be a shared resource. There should be a way of eking it out equitably.
I think it should definitely be a shared resource because that's the only option. There's no second option. But what we need to look at is the agreement that was signed between mainly sub-Saharan African countries of the Nile River did provide that framework, which the Egyptians had reservation on Article 14B of that agreement. And that is because they wanted to maintain the historical rights, as they call it, given to them through the 1929
it's got the customary right of use.
It is the historical. So what the others are saying, look, we need to really share this. We need to work on this together. Now, solutions can be all sorts of solutions. Definitely for hydroelectric power, there are other environment-friendly resources like solar and wind.
I mean, let's not forget that Egypt built its own dam.
Absolutely, absolutely. But there could always be all sorts of options that all the countries in good faith can come together and work out, and even reviews whatever agreement they may reach today.
You should have appendices to every agreement.
Yes.
But Harry, I will come to you. I just want to know, how far is Egypt willing to compromise, and what is it willing to do to protect its historical right over the Nile?
Well, Egyptian rhetoric, of course, for the last decade or so has been rather belligerent, and many people would say rather provocative. But the truth is that Egypt, given its fiscal position at the moment in time, and given the weakness of its armed forces, which are tied up in the Sinai desert, desperately trying to fight an insurgency, is that Egypt actually doesn't have many economic or military levers to pull. Very similarly, because Egypt has by and large ignored first the Organization of African Unity and then the African Union for the last 2 decades, and has only in recent years tried to expand again its diplomatic missions and its intelligence networks, Egypt has very little political influence over the states of the Nile Basin or further afield. So the truth is, and this is what people like myself who've been trying to talk to the Egyptian government for the last couple of years have been trying to tell them, is that the sooner they come to the negotiating table and they understand that the situation has changed and it requires a change in mindset,
Yes.
the sooner they do that, the sooner we can also actually start working on the very issues that my other panelists were referring to, which is trying to address the actual environmental, economic, and social problems, which are very, very deep, which are going to worsen even more, as you rightly said, in the context of global climatic changes, in the context of population growth, in the context of very high unemployment and very deeply entrenched poverty. But unfortunately, the Egyptian government remains pretty much beholden to a very narrow nationalistic mindset, which actually does very little to protect Egypt's national interest, but it does very much to protect the interest of the elite that controls Egypt. And there's a very important
But there
difference.
is, I mean, Egypt also has this pressure hanging over it, that it knows its population is going to hit something like 120 million people by 2030. And even the UN is saying, look, water is going to be a massive problem in Egypt by 2030.
But it's a question, Sheila, very simply put, it's a question of distribution. Who uses most of the water in Egypt? To which farms does it go? To which industries? And who are people who are systematically being deprived of water? And that is a conversation that the Egyptian government has not been willing to have and to entertain. And this is something that truly infuriates people in other parts of the Nile Basin, because they understand very well that this kind of disproportionate allocation of water resources and of good land to firms tied to the military-industrial establishment in Egypt is not a fair argument then to say, oh, you are taking water away from poor Egyptians. This is simply not the case. This is simply an illusion.
John, Egypt, certainly under Mohamed Morsi, was quite belligerent about this. Abdel Fattah al-Sisi has met with the new Ethiopian Prime Minister. Do we see a time where there will be diplomacy and those agreements, those past agreements of 29 and 59 can be renegotiated? Is that what we're moving towards?
Well, I think that whether or not those agreements get renegotiated would depend to a large extent on Egypt, because the other riparian countries have been trying to negotiate an agreement for the last several years, but they've been stuck on Article 14B, which is basically an attempt by the Egyptians to say, okay, we will come to the table and negotiate any agreement you want, but only on condition that the 1929 agreement is not tampered with. The Egyptians claim that we have a water security problem, which is true, but their idea of water security is that those rights that they acquired through what they call natural rights, because they've been using the Nile for thousands of years. And in addition to that, the rights that were granted to them by the Anglo-Egyptian Treaty, they do not want those rights tampered with. And I think that is an untenable position, because in order for this problem of the Nile to be resolved, we have to look at the Nile as an international water course belonging to all these countries. If we don't approach the problem that way, we are going to continue to have this issue.
I suppose the question is, how volatile is this situation? How far do you think Egypt? I mean, you talk about conflict.
Yeah.
Are we going to see a war over this?
This book, 25 years ago, 1993, came out.
I mean, you've been talking about this for a long time. So where do you think this situation?
And I talked. The idea of this book came even when I was talking to President Sadat in 1976. There was Boutros Ghali. The Egyptians under the Colonel Nasser military rule, they actually neglected the whole Africa. Egypt is an African country, and they decided to go into the Arabs and have this sort of pan-Arabism megalomaniac idea rather than actually focusing on the Nile. We should actually take politics out of it. It should not be a political solution. The customary use have to be respected. If I have a house...
But I mean, with all due respect, I think in this situation, a political solution is the only...
No, actually, they really should all take... Bilateral agreement is not going to work, because the Ethiopian can say, okay, I am going to give you hydraulic power from the dam to help dig. The Jonglei Canal is 360 kilometer, about 240, it's about 180 left. So they say, okay, we'll give you electric power to actually do this one. Until we develop our agriculture, you can actually do this. It should not be a zero-sum game, you see.
The approach has been by all these states so far has been very much political, because the Egyptians have been counting on the political instabilities in Ethiopia mainly, but across the region. And that has not been a long-term sustainable solution. There is now another good news for the Egyptians, probably for the near term, and that is Ethiopia is now going through transition again. So there's a lot of instability in Ethiopia, which is making now not just the Nile River, but even the dam itself less of a priority. But then that will not be a sustainable solution.
All right, gentlemen, we are going to have to leave it there. But thank you very much indeed for joining me. That's been a great discussion on the Nile and control of the Nile. That's it from me for now. Until next time, bye-bye.